from a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, how to provide assistance to your loved ones when they don't know the difference between twerking and tweaking. And now, the podcast host who has no worries for such things because he is definitely not a tweaker, Pete Dominick.
Thank you very much. That is Pete Co, everybody. He is the announcer for the show at Pete Co VO. That's COEVO. Go hit him up and thank him. He's a sick bastard, as you know, and I absolutely adore him. So go give him some love over there on Twitter. And if you need somebody to do a voiceover, a jingle, or anything else, very talented musician and voiceover actor. And I'd love to see him get more work because I don't pay him at all. As a matter of fact, he was late with the intro today, and I was outraged, really outraged. He said he hadn't even eaten yet, and I told him, that's not my problem. Get me my intro. And he did. Thank you, Pete. Good work. Now, you may have a meal, a piece of cheese, or whatever scraps are left around for the help. Okay, everybody, welcome to today's episode of Stand Up. Very special guest, Tim Wise. I mean, Tim joins me pretty regularly, but it's always special. And I don't know. Every time he's on, people say he should be on every week. And I would give anything to hear any of you argue with him. So if Tim ever says anything that you disagree with or don't like the tone of, send me a voicemail and I'll play for Tim and let him address it. But he is on fire today, as he always is. I think you're really going to like it. Anti-racist speaker. We take on the whole Dilbert thing, African-American AP studies, and a lot more. And I think you're going to really like it. I got a few clips. I brought you a few clips to share. I'm going to share a couple clips, and then we'll get to my conversation with Tim, but just want to mention, of course, today is Thursday, and I host the subscriber hangout every Thursday. Can't wait for tonight. Hope to see your face there. If you're not a subscriber, what are you doing? You're missing out on a pretty amazing weekly event that we do. If you have never joined our hangout, then, I mean, you got to give it a shot. I mean, subscribe for a day, even. StandUpWithPete.com, Patreon.com/Pete Dominick, and have the amazing experience of being around some people who are a lot smarter and funnier than I am. It's just an amazing room. You should stop by. Tonight at 8 o'clock, special guests, I hope, will be there. I'm going to invite a few people, and I'm going to have a major announcement. You might know what it is if you've heard me talking about teasing a thing. I'm going to have a major announcement this evening about my, going to have a good announcement. So if you're a subscriber, make sure you come at 8 o'clock. I'll announce at 8:15 my big announcement. And I look forward to seeing you at the hangout. If you're not a subscriber, I mean, what are you doing? You listen to the show for free? You can't, no $5 a month? You can't do it? Please sign up. StandUpWithPete.com. StandUpWithPete.com right now. Welcome to all new subscribers, and shout outs to longtime subscribers, Gary Robinson, Jody Marie Miller, and the great John Donvan, who has been subscribing and very generous for a long time. We got to get him back on the show. Can't do it without your subscriptions. Thank you very much. Sign up now. Okay, I plugged enough. Let's get to it, shall we? Yesterday was a busy day of crazy things being said by people and developments in the world. I'm going to give you a few of those right now. First of all, I want to start off with this story coming out of Israel, and Jake Tapper and CNN correspondent in the Middle East is Hadas Gold. They about cover it, but the headline basically is U.S. condemns Israel. Far-right ministers call for Palestinian town to be erased.
And Hadas, Israel's finance minister, he's one of the two extremists in the cabinet. His name is Bezalel Smotrich. He today said that the West Bank Palestinian town where two Israeli brothers were shot and killed on Sunday, where the Israelis rampage, the settlers rampage, he said it needs to be erased, that town. Take a look.
I think the village of Hawara needs to be erased. I think that the state of Israel needs to do this, and God forbid, not private people.
He's saying that Israel needs to get rid of this Palestinian town. That sounds an awful lot like ethnic cleansing. Has Netanyahu said anything about this?
Netanyahu has not directly addressed Smotrich's statements. The former prime minister, now opposition leader Yair Lapid, essentially called it an incitement to a war crime. Smotrich was responding to a question about why he actually liked a tweet that said the same thing, and he essentially repeated himself. Now, afterwards, he tried to issue some sort of, I don't even know if I can call it a clarification, saying, I did not mean that we should wipe out the village of Wara, only to act in a targeted manner against the terrorists and supporters of terrorism and to exact a heavy price from them in order to restore security to the residents of the area. The reason being Hawara, it's often a flashpoint city where there are clashes, there's violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinians. But this comment specifically is getting a really harsh reaction, including from the U.S. State Department. Take a listen.
These comments were irresponsible. They were repugnant. They were disgusting. And just as we condemn Palestinian incitement to violence, we condemn these provocative remarks that also amount to incitement to violence. We call on Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials to publicly and clearly reject and disavow these comments.
And Jake, Netanyahu has not yet specifically responded to Smotrich's remarks, but I have to tell you that those remarks for Ned Price are some of the harshest remarks about an Israeli minister I think I've ever heard from the American government. Jake?
Yeah, they're shocking. And his walk back, I didn't mean to say exactly what I said, was interesting.
Jake Tapper going with a measured response. The Palestinian Minister for Civilian Affairs didn't. He went to Twitter and called for international human rights organizations to prosecute that Israeli minister on charges for calling for massacres against Palestinians. And also, that Israeli minister is expected to visit the U.S. the second week of March for a meeting of the Israel Bonds Organization. Israeli officials have said he hasn't asked for any meetings with the Biden administration. Two U.S. officials told Axios that even if he asked for the meetings with Biden officials, he likely would not get them. And well, that's pretty good. That's the Israeli finance minister, by the way, calling for a Palestinian village to be wiped out by the Israeli government. Okay, well, no big deal. Moving on. Speaking of crazy, yesterday a crazy person did a crazy thing, and the President of the United States decided to respond to it. The President's comments came one day after Marjorie Taylor Greene, during a hearing on Capitol Hill, asked a Michigan mother and conservative activist Rebecca Kiesling, who lost two children to fentanyl-related deaths on July 29th, 2020, if her sons would be alive if, quote, our government would secure our southern border. Well, President Biden mocked Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, sarcastically asking a room full of Democrats during their annual retreat in Baltimore, isn't she amazing? Listen to this.
And, you know, a little bit of more Marjorie Taylor Greene and a few more, you're going to have a lot of Republicans running our way. Isn't she amazing? Oof. Ours, the reason she was very specific. I shouldn't digress, probably. I've read. She was very specific recently, saying that a poor mother who lost two kids to fentanyl, that I killed her sons. Well, the interesting thing is that fentanyl they took came during the last administration.
Well, I didn't love that little giggle at the end, much less the whole thing. I didn't love it. I don't think it was the classiest thing Joe Biden's ever done, but he was speaking to a room filled with House Democrats who work with Marjorie Taylor Greene every day. But he also knew he was speaking to the rest of the nation, obviously. Knew he was being recorded. I didn't love that. I didn't. Lady lost two of her kids, but I also didn't love that lady blaming this president, much less Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I watched those comments yesterday, which if you go back and watch it, I think you'll see why he felt the need to respond. But okay, well, speaking of President Biden being demonized by, in this case, Marjorie Taylor Greene and that poor woman who lost her kids, even though Joe Biden wasn't president when it happened. Another terrible thing. This is the head of the House Oversight Committee, Congressman James Comer of Kentucky. Well, he he was on a radio show yesterday, and he criticized a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney for not prosecuting President Biden's late son when he was still alive. And the headlines are pretty interesting. White House slams despicable suggestion Beau Biden should have been indicted. House Oversight Chair laments that Joe Biden's dead son was never prosecuted. Here it is.
This U.S. attorney had an opportunity to go after the Bidens years ago. In fact, it was Beau Biden, the president's other son, that was involved in some campaign donations from a person that got indicted, as well as Joe Biden was involved in some of these campaign donations when he was a senator and then when he ran for president against Obama. But, nothing ever happened. So I don't know much about this U.S. attorney other than he's had an opportunity to investigate the Bidens before, and he chose not to. We all know that he's just been silent for a long time.
That's Congressman Comer. James Comer, Kentucky, going after Beau Biden. People on Twitter were saying, why don't they dig up Beau Biden's body and subpoena him? It wouldn't be that absurd, actually, in this day and age, this Republican Party, when he's not busy threatening pay TV providers. Congressman Comer, is what the Daily Beast says, for not carrying his favorite right-wing channels or warning that Chinese spy balloons may drop bioweapons on the U.S. Comer has devoted much of his energy to launching an investigation into presidential son Hunter Biden's business dealings, and now lamenting that a Trump-appointed attorney didn't indict Beau Biden. Wow, what a shame. Speaking of class acts, James Comer, another profile in courage, great American. And speaking of terrible people, really just bad faith, this case, we go to the U.S. Senate, where we find the senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy, with a terrible bad faith hack argument that has been echoing around the right-wing chamber, and it made it right there to the attorney general, who was on Capitol Hill yesterday, being just absolutely raked, grilled, shouted at by Senator Cruz, which I will spare you, and Josh Hawley, I'll spare you that as well. Just preposterous. But I can't not play this one clip, because John Kennedy goes after the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, over this whole issue about the DOJ wanting to investigate or prosecute parents who are just expressing their opinions and their frustrations at Board of Education meetings, which is not what happened. It's not even remotely close to what happened. Here's a story that I followed closely because it was so close to my home. Literally, I was in the fight at the Board of Education last year and continue to be in my town. And as you know, this is happening all over the country. There is a kind of trade group, an organization of boards of education around the country. It's Google DOJ Board of Education memo. A judge dismissed a lawsuit over this on grounds that it was just complete bullshit, basically. A federal judge threw out a lawsuit that parents from accused Attorney General Merrick Garland of stifling their free speech, saying the group misunderstood a memo addressing increased harassment against the schools. And here's the thing that really just frustrates me more than anything else about this. And it's so disingenuous and such bad faith. The people who are on the Board of Education are overwhelmingly parents and overwhelmingly volunteers. It is such a thankless job. And the fact that parents who are volunteers are being screamed at by other parents who barely or even often engage in their kids' education. They don't even go to the open house or parent-teacher meetings. I mean, I'm being a little cynical here, but that's my experience. The fact that those parents are screaming at other parents, and then you're acting like the Board of Education is some powerful group, some shadowy group of corrupt, money-hungry people. They're parents themselves, and they're volunteers. And that is the thing that just frustrates me more than anything else about this BS. Anyway, here's John Kennedy. I think the Attorney General acquits himself perfectly fine. But he could take some advice from his pal Pete by simply making the point that I did. The people on the board are also parents and also volunteers.
didn't you understand the chilling effect that it would have to parents when you issued your directive, when you directed your criminal divisions and your counterterrorism divisions to investigate parents who were angry at school boards and administrators during COVID?
So, Senator, if you just give me a moment to put the full context, I did not do that. I did not issue any memorandum directing the investigation of parents who were concerned about their children. Quite to the contrary, the memorandum that you're talking about says at the very beginning of the memorandum that vigorous public debate is protected by the First Amendment. And the kind of concerns that you're talking about are, as expressed by parents, are, of course, completely protected. The memorandum was aimed at violence and threats of violence against a whole host of school personnel. It was not aimed at parents making complaints to their school board. And it came in the context of a whole series of other kinds of violent threats and violence against other public officials.
All right. So if you hear that complaint being made, just Google DOJ memo parents. There's several fact checks that will explain the nuance of that situation, but also remind people that the Board of Education is almost always parents. It's almost always volunteers. All right. That's all the clips I've got for you here. I'm going to get to my conversation with Tim Wise. Are there any other news stories? I just want to mention, of course, you probably know that Lori Lightfoot is out as the mayor of Chicago. There was a primary, and now there's going to be a runoff in Chicago. A Republican in Florida's state legislature proposed eliminating the Florida Democratic Party. A Republican in Florida state legislature's idea is to eliminate the opposition, the whole party. So that's totally normsies. Mississippi's Republican governor signed a bill banning transgender health care for minors. You're seeing that happen all over the country, despite what healthcare providers and experts think should be done. Who cares what they think? They're just doctors who deal with it every day. I'm a politician. This will score me points. I don't care about human beings who are probably now going to have to deal with a terrible, terrible depression, potential suicide. I don't care. FBI Director Christopher Wray sat down with Fox News, which is super weird because Fox News just proved that they're liars, and he definitely shouldn't have done that to explain it. He thinks the COVID-19 pandemic most likely started after a lab incident. So he's supporting the lab leak theory on Fox News. That's our FBI Director Christopher Wray, who definitely should not be in that position, never should have gotten that job. And speaking of which, the big story yesterday, the biggest story in my mind was the Washington Post big blockbuster that there was a huge fight within the FBI, between the FBI and the DOJ about getting all of those classified documents out of Mar-a-Lago from Trump. It's a big, big story. I highly recommend you read it because there's a lot of nuance in it, but it's very good reporting from award-winning reporters. And to me, that's a very big story. I think it's so interesting to think how the right in America has painted the FBI as being anti-Trump and as being even at times liberal or in a tank for Democrats or whatever they want to say. When, of course, the left has always seen the FBI as being more conservative, which I think it's far more likely that they are. In the end, the nuance is probably that there are a lot of MAGA supporting FBI leaders in different offices around the country. There probably is. And that is why it's so infuriating to hear Trump demonize the FBI, because they literally are his supporters doing him favors in some offices and in some cases. And it certainly seems to be in this case surrounding the documents that he had there. Read that story. I highly recommend it. All right. Let's get to my guest, Tim Wise. He is one of the best. You know him. Do I even have to introduce him? He's a regular here on the show. I highly recommend that you get all of his books, that you subscribe to him on Medium and Patreon and Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise on Twitter, timjwise.medium.com. His most recent book, I believe, is Dispatches from the Race War. He is an anti-racist educator, speaker, and author of 9 books, and he is simply one of the best, smartest, most righteous people I know. I love talking to him. He's become a good friend of mine. And ladies and gentlemen, here is our latest great Tim Wise right now. All right, there he is. Tim Wise, thank you so much for joining me. Lots of questions.
Sure.
First of all, are you a fan of the Dilbert comic strip? I can see you. I can see you loving that office humor. I don't even know what it is, actually. Office humor or something like
I guess office humor, if your idea of office life still looks like 1958. Some, square-headed Drew Carey looking white dude in a tie. And I don't even mean like Drew Carey now. I mean like Drew Carey in the old days, the flat top look, straight out of Parma, Ohio, or wherever the hell he's from. It's like that doesn't look like any office, which is why Dilbert, never resonated as much as, let's say, The Office, that show did, or even Office Space, the movie. Like, all of those were better iterations of Dilbert. And yet Dilbert just kept getting published until this week, which is great. The sound of Scott Adams's career crashing is an absolutely lovely thing.
So I wanted to get to the kind of roots of where he started, because it's a kind of a confusing thing, and you can help us unwind this. But there is this poll, a Rasmussen poll, which you could start by kind of questioning that polling company, which I'm sure you will. But it asked if it's, quote, okay to be white. And I mean, like, I don't even know what that means. And partially, I don't know what white means, I mean, we can all identify however we want, but it's a bit of a weird question. So what do you make of the poll and the question before we get to Scott Adams, what he said about it? Right.
I mean, first of all, we could spend a lot of time on Rasmussen as a polling company. They have a terrible reputation, actually. They're the only company that ever found Donald Trump with a 50% or better approval rating. These are people who constantly think the Republicans are going to take back the House. They're going to take back the Senate. Trump is going to be president forever. Like, they're wrong literally all the time. And yet people keep throwing money at them because they tell them what they want to hear. So that's number one. But putting all of that aside, putting aside the politics, and before we get to Scott Adams, just the poll itself is so fascinating for how bad it is. I'm just talking methodologically. Now, I'm not a pollster, but I know how to do social science and read social science. And so a real quick primer. The more people you have in a sample of a poll or a survey, the more accurate and more representative it becomes, obviously. And even the most representative polls have what is called a standard error built in, right? Where the actual answer that you're trying to get could be anywhere between this point, and they usually pick the mid-range, and that's the one they put in the poll. So if you've got 100,000 people in a survey, you have a pretty good confidence that that's a representative sample of the population, and they call it 95% confidence interval is the technical language, and usually the range, the standard error is pretty small. So you're getting a pretty good thing. This poll had 1,000 people in it. 1,000 people. We don't know how they were selected. We don't know whether they were landline or cell phones. We don't know the actual methodology of the poll, because Rasmussen won't show you unless you're willing to pay $19.95 to become some gold member, because they're right wingers, and right wingers are on a grift always.
Really?
And so 1,000 people got polled. Now, 1,000 people can be a decent sample size. If you're asking people, what kind of ice cream do you prefer, chocolate or vanilla? Or do you like coffee or tea? These are non-controversial questions that don't have political or ideological baggage. But when you ask a question like, is it okay to be white? Or their other question, do you think black people can be racist? Like, those are questions that carry a lot of baggage and a lot of assumptions. So it's a weird question anyway. But of that 1,000 people, only 13% were black, meaning they polled 130 black people and asked them, do you think it's okay to be white? And 26% said no. That's 34 black people that they found who said, maybe it's not okay to be white. There are 42 million black people in the United States. I don't have the calculator in front of me, but it's like 0.000 to the infinite out of your ass power number of black people that they found. And now Scott Adams has tanked his career by saying, this proves black people are a hate group. We should get the fuck away from them. His words, not mine. We meaning white people, we should just all move away from black people, which, point out, Scott Adams had already moved away from black people. He has never been around black people, but he swears he's been helping them his whole life, no doubt, with the representation in his comic strip of all the black characters. in the office, meaning zero. So this poll is terrible. It's an incredibly small number of people. It's an even smaller number of black people. If they had asked 1,000 black people or 10,000, you could at least say it was representative, perhaps. But even then, the question about the way it's worded. So when you ask, is it okay to be white? Couple things come to mind for me. Number one is that it is well known by anyone who spends any time online. And a lot of black folks are online. A lot of black folks are, keyed into what's going on the interwebs. It's not like they're not around. They know that meme, that phrase originated in the bowels of 4chan and or other white nationalist spaces on the web. It was created by a bunch of racist trolls.
Yeah, the Washington Post says the phrase "it's okay to be white" was popularized in 2017 as a trolling campaign meant to provoke liberals into condemning the statement, and thus the theory went, proving their own unreasonableness. White supremacists picked up on the trend, adding neo-Nazi language, websites, or images to flyers with the phrase "it's okay to be white." And I think that's, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't want people to think it was just like something that you had heard. I mean, here's the Washington Post saying it as well, and they should know they have a very diverse editorial board. Did you hear about that?
Yeah. Yes.
But let's not go off on a tangent. Staying on that phrase, as you were saying, go ahead.
Yeah, so it starts there. And I've seen these flyers all around. When I've gone to college campuses, black folks have seen them. People have seen them around. It's okay to be white. And yes, the whole idea, and it was a pretty genius trolling campaign, I guess, because what they were thinking was, if you don't agree with that, well, you're obviously anti-white. You're a bigot. And if you do agree with it, good, comrade, you're one of our Nazis now. It's sort of a no lose for them. But the point is, if I know that's the origin, or I've heard that might be the origin, when you ask me, is it okay to be white? I could be sitting there, white or black, thinking, I don't know how I want to answer this, because I don't want to say something that makes me sound like one of those guys, right? And in fact, if you look at the poll, interestingly, there were like 20 something or 30% of white people who weren't sure it was okay to be white either. I'm guessing that percentage of white folks are not actually self-hating. It's probably also white folks that were like, wait, what? This is like a crazy question. The other problem, though, and this is one that most people haven't pointed out, but I will, because this is my lane. This is what I do. The problem, this is what I said on Twitter yesterday, and I want to explain the phrasing here.
Yeah.
It's obviously okay to be white, because if you're white, you're just white. You were born in a country that made that what you are. You're white. But it's not okay to be white. And people might be like, what kind of wordplay is that? Here's what I mean. The only way we even became white in the first place, those of us who are of European descent, was because the concept of the white race was created 375 or so years ago, 350 some odd years ago, mid 1600s. Why was it created? It was only created for one purpose: to justify the subordination of anyone who wasn't European, specifically the conquest of indigenous land, the enslavement of African labor. So if the very notion of being white was always and only for the purpose at its origin of justifying oppression, you could make the argument that even though it's not your fault now, if you're white, like you're just white, it's fine. But to be white is only possible because of this horrible system. So I might answer that question by saying, no, it's not, because that history is horrible. That might be what I mean. Now, is that what black folks mean? I don't know. Maybe those 34 black people are, on the street corners in New York City. They're black Hebrew Israelites yelling about cracker babies. Right. I don't know who they are. And Rasmussen won't tell me unless I want to give them $19.95 of my money. And I fucking don't. Right. So it's absolutely ridiculous. And yet, right-wingers all over the web are making a huge deal of this, which suggests to me that Rasmussen did this as a troll, just like 4chan put it out there as a troll. It was intended to get this response. It was intended to remind conservative and MAGA folks, we're your pollsters. Don't forget, give us your $19.95. And when it comes time you're running for office, George Santos, you need us. Just hire us. We're the company for you. So it doesn't indicate widespread anti-white animus on the part of black people. It doesn't indicate that white people are the new victims of anything. What it indicates is that Scott Adams cannot draw three-dimensional characters, and he doesn't know how to read social science data, which is actually hilarious.
Let's talk about just some of the comments. I mean, it almost doesn't seem worth talking about, but you always give thoughtful insight on this stuff. I don't know. I guess, Tim, I get so kind of, depressed when I saw Scott Adams video. I know people think this way. I just always kind of classify them as really uneducated, backwoods, ignorant people who haven't had any, a lot of experience around diversity and so on. Seeing Scott Adams say that, knowing about, polling on white folks in America a lot, overwhelming apparently, in some polls thinking that they're more discriminated against black folks, then seeing Elon Musk touting Scott Adams, and we can shit on him all day long, but he's got 125 million followers, and Elon Musk responding to Adams calling black Americans a hate group, basically saying that he's right and that white people are discriminated against, and that the media is racist. I mean, you can add any color to that you want, but it was really, I guess, depressing to see such prominent people speak so openly for their hatred, to say that black Americans, A, are a group, and B, they are a hate group. How do you respond to what he actually said?
I agree, but it is dispiriting. I don't know that it's depressing, but it is dispiriting when the wealthiest man on the planet essentially co-signs this kind of ignorance, A, because it's racist, and B, because, again, it's some basic social science, which tells us why Elon Musk cannot, in fact, get his fucking cars to drive themselves, because he does not know how to read a poll. If you do not know how to read a poll, I do not trust you to hire engineers that can make your wheels go and not run over babies in carriages, or whatever the hell that Tesla does this week. So obviously, this is someone we ought not listen to. He's not nearly as bright as we think he is. And irony of ironies, when a white man born and raised in South Africa tells you that black people are the problem and that white people are the victims, you know you're dealing with peak irony, right? This is somebody who, for whom irony has died. It was run over by a Tesla somewhere in China that went nuts and went on autopilot and just kept driving until it ran over the irony that is Elon Musk. Obviously, we shouldn't be listening to him. Sadly, too many people do listen to him. And when he's called out, of course, he won't engage. He will engage with Scott Adams. He will engage with trolls on Twitter who only have 37 followers, as long as they're saying something nice about him or something he agrees with. But if you dare step to him and critique him, he will not. He will not respond to you. He will not engage, because he doesn't want to acknowledge that anyone else could know more than he does about anything, nor does he want to signal boost anyone who opposes him, because he wants everyone to think that everyone agrees with what it is he has to say. Right. So it's dispiriting, but it's par for the course. You can take the apartheid out of the boy. You cannot take the boy out of apartheid. That is what Elon Musk is proving for many years.
Yeah. You think there's a lot.
Or it's the other way around. You can take the boy out of apartheid. You can't take the apartheid out of the boy, I should say. I think I said it wrong.
That's fine. We understood.
I was so excited to say it. Then I fucked it up. Because,
we understood.
I had one job, and I totally screwed it up.
Listen, you're pretty much 99% on nailing it when speaking. So if you get that wrong, we'll excuse it. But I mean, you think that's certainly something that animates his views on race, his childhood in South Africa.
I don't see how it can't. This is somebody who literally wants people to think he's a self-made genius. But if he'd been born black in South Africa, no one would know who the hell he is. And that's not to say that he's not a capable person. I mean, I'm sort of mocking him for making cars that don't really run on their own. But I know he's bright. I know he's intelligent, but he could be just as bright, just as intelligent, have just as many great ideas. And if he had been born black in South Africa, he would not be in the position that he is. And everyone with any sense of honesty or integrity knows that. So that doesn't mean he isn't capable, doesn't mean he's a complete and utter moron, but it does mean that he has been helped along by his race, and yet he has the temerity to turn around and act like somehow it's white people who are being the victims of this awful hate group known as black people, which apparently involves 34 black people that Rasmussen polls finally was able to find, and suddenly we should take seriously. Right-wingers never take black people seriously when they say anything else, but let them say this weird thing in a poll, and it's like, oh, listen to the black people. We should take them seriously. I don't know about that.
Tim, maybe I missed it, and I'm not being facetious here, but I think that saying that, all the things that he said, Scott Adams, and posted them on YouTube, you would think that either YouTube or Twitter would consider that hate speech and a violation. I don't know. Maybe they have. But do you think that qualifies? Should it qualify?
I don't know. I mean, to call black people hateful isn't in and of itself, I guess, an act of hate. It's stupid. It's ignorant. To say we should get the fuck away from them, as he did, certainly sounds pretty racist to me. I don't know whether it violates their TOSs or not. Or T's OS, I guess would be the proper grammatical way to say it, terms of service. But is it obviously racist? Yeah. Now he's trying to walk it back. He's trying to say, well, you're just missing the context. No, I'm not. No, I watched it. No, I watched it. In fact, there were people, even other conservatives who have always liked him, who weighed in on his Twitter and were like, dude, I watched it live. Like when you did it, I saw you say it. It's exactly what you said. And he's trying to walk it back in between bong hits on YouTube or whatever, that's his thing. He wants to deny that he said it, but it's out there. We all know it. And what's funny is the people that are backing him up on Twitter are even worse. Like it's hilarious. Today, I was engaged with people on Twitter who were attacking me for attacking him and saying, you're a Jew. Oh, well, okay. First of all, like we all know that. Like I've written, you did not just discover that the captain from Captain and Tennille does not actually pilot a boat. We all know. It's, and that's a joke that will only land with your listeners over the age of 50, but it's still worth it for that small sliver of the demographic.
We appreciate you, sir.
We all know that I'm a Jew. You people with 13 followers on Twitter are not revealing anything important. But when you say that, when that's your response and you're trying to defend a guy against the charge of being a bigot, that's not a good look, right? It's like the guy that came to the Nazi that came to my speech in Cincinnati several years ago. And at the end, I called on him because I always make a practice of calling on the one that I know is the Nazi. And they had been protesting outside my gig. And I'm like, hey, you can come in as long as you don't heckle. I'll give you the first question and then you're on your way because I want to be fair. I want to be ecumenical. So I let this guy in. He goes to the Q&A. I ask him if he has a question and he spends his 30 seconds asking me about why, or making the allegation that Schindler's List was an act of fiction because the Holocaust never happened. To which my response was, you had 30 seconds and you thought the best thing that you could spend your 30 seconds on was denying the Holocaust. It's like these people on Twitter. You think the best way to defend Scott Adams against a charge of bigotry is to ramp up the bigotry? What the fuck is wrong with you?
What did you say?
What's that?
But how did you respond to the Nazi?
Oh, most of them I just ignored, or I corrected their data, or I said, like one of them said, what did he say? He said something like, black people don't know that started on 4chan. You know who does know? Jews. And I didn't actually respond at all. Some other black guy weighed in.
I meant to the guy, I think that you said the guy who came to your talk and said, denied the Holocaust. How do you handle that?
Oh, well, what I told them was you just spent your 30 seconds. Right. You thought that was your best play was to do that. You thought to yourself, I'm going to endear myself to this audience of 400 people. How can I do it? Will I rebut him on affirmative action? Will I rebut him on this? No, I'm going to go in on the Jews and Schindler's List, one of the most beloved movies of all time. I'm going to go in on that. I'm going to attack Steven Spielberg and recruit new Nazis. Like that was his plan. And I just mocked him, made fun of him. And then told him to get the fuck out, and security removed him because I told him you get one question and then you got to go. So
did you see? Not that you haven't made this critique much more articulately and effectively, but did you see Bryan Cranston talking to Chris Wallace about MAGA?
Yeah, it was great.
I thought he did a really good job, and I thought it was really important that he is so outspoken because he's such a famous guy who's been in so many, great series and likable series. I'm sure people will just dismiss him. But still, I thought that was really important. And I thought you might I played that on yesterday's show. I'm sure people have heard it at this point. It kind of went viral. But when you hear that Make America Great Again, I mean, you've written all about this. But I think we can never it never gets old to remind people how that is heard by a huge number of people, not only in America, around the world.
Right. I mean, I thought it was great that he said it, not because it was original, not because it was unique. We've all been saying it for many years, but because he's Bryan Cranston and is a star of arguably one of the 3 or 4 best, depending on who you ask, television shows in the history of the genre. And it's loved by a lot of MAGA people. A lot of MAGA people love Breaking Bad. And so for him to say it, will anger them, I'm sure. And next time they're casting, they're going to be like, shit, it really is going to have to be Scott Baio in this role. Oh, Jesus. Well, okay. It can't be Bryan Cranston. We're going to have to get James Woods. We're going to have to get Scott Baio, or we're going to have to get that Kevin Sorbo guy is going to have to be our go-to. But it was great that he said it. It's an obvious argument. And what bothered me the most about it was Chris Wallace's smug look was so aggravating in the clip, because Chris Wallace just looked at him like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And yet it's the most inarguable thing. And he said it in such a nice way. He didn't even say it like, all of your listeners on Fox all those years were horrible people, or MAGA people are terrible people, or Trump people are terrible. He didn't say anything like that, right? All he said was, you just got to understand how things hit. And I think that's actually a really interesting metaphor for so much of what goes on in this country. When you say, for instance, we're anti-woke and Florida is where woke goes to die, and we're going to ban this book and that book and this history and this theory and this analysis. You got to understand, putting aside the fact that you don't actually understand any of the analyses that you're critiquing, and you aren't really willing to engage in that in that discussion. Do you understand how it feels and what it sounds like to a black person when you say, we're going to not allow a discussion of racism as a systemic phenomenon? We're just not going, because that's what the law says in Florida, that you cannot discuss racism as anything other than an aberration from an otherwise pluralistic democratic system. That's a paraphrase, but it's pretty close to exactly what it said. Basically says you've got to talk about racism as aberrant. You can't talk about it as systemic. Well, the vast majority of black people, when polled in a representative poll, not 34 people or 130 people, but probably even that number, probably any number of black people you can find, overwhelmingly are going to tell you that, of course, the history of racism has been one of systemic injustice. So what you've basically said is the entire black perspective on things cannot be, or the dominant one, the vast majority of black people's perspective cannot be considered. And you don't even think about what that feels like. You don't care what that feels like. You don't care what that sounds like. And when you are ambivalent about that, when you say, well, too bad, they should just change their perspective, you're being racist, because you're suggesting that an entire group of people's theory and understanding of their own lived experience is not worth considering, right? No one is saying that we can't have the traditional interpretation. It's out there. We learn the traditional interpretation. We learn the history of the founders. We learn the Federalist Papers. We learn the bullshit story still about George Washington and that damn cherry tree, a story that didn't even happen. And yet children are still learning that bullshit, right? So we learn all of that. And all we're saying is we ought to also learn this. And rather than say, OK, let's look at all the possible interpretations of American history, including these that are more radical and critical, the right is saying, no, you can't have that perspective at all. You can only have essentially a conservative, rah, patriotic type of education, which is exactly what they do in China. It's exactly what they do in North Korea. It's exactly what they do in Russia, which is probably why these folks like it. It's exactly what they do in every totalitarian regime that's ever existed. They hate fundamentally this country. They hate fundamentally the Constitution of the United States. And they sure as hell hate the interpretation of lived experience that black people have, because they don't want anybody to even consider it.
So well said. Yeah. Let's talk about the situation in Florida. You had this epic thread on Twitter, which I thought was so important. Everybody should go read the whole thing, but I kind of want you to encapsulate as much as you want or can with me now. This is about the advanced placement tests. And now, apparently, in Florida, they're going to also censor actual college. I mean, AP courses are actual college courses, but they're taken by high schoolers. That's the definition of advanced placement. But now they're going to intervene in college courses. And this is like, people are saying all kinds of things about calling this, but I think as Jason Stanley, who's an expert on fascism, is the one who said, no, this is fascism. I mean, that's what it is, censoring the speech you don't like and the courses you don't like. But talk to me about what we need to know here.
Well, I mean, it is fascinating. You know, courts have long given states a lot of leeway in how they do their K-12 education. And that can create lots of problems. But for the most part, the notion of academic freedom has insulated college faculty from that kind of intervention by the state. because it is understood that there is a different interest in academic freedom at that level and the sharing of lots of different views. Kids are not kids anymore. Number one, they tend to be adults. Secondly, it's not a captive audience. You're choosing to be there. You're paying to go there. But Ron DeSantis doesn't care about that. He's basically saying, no, if you go to school in Florida, especially at a state institution, you're not going to be able to learn any type of critical analysis. And in fact, any theoretical discussions in the general education classes can't be had, because apparently Ron DeSantis is one of those kinds of fools that think theory means it's not factual, because he doesn't understand what the word theory means in either science or social science. Like, evolution is a theory, but science can demonstrate it. Gravity is a theory, but science can demonstrate it. Social science theories can be proven within a reasonable certainty by correlation or causality by social scientists. And what Ron DeSantis is saying is, no, you can't even have that conversation. He wants to completely ban any kind of gender studies, right? I mean, so when you do that, it really, first of all, I cannot fathom that any court is going to allow this to stand. I think this is all political grandstanding by DeSantis, because it's no lose, right? Either the courts uphold it, in which case he gets what he wants, or they strike it down, in which case he says, see, you need to elect me president so I can appoint judges who will strike these things down. Almost any judge, even the most right-wing judge, and I say this, I hope I am right about this, and I think I am. I think even the most reactionary of justices, certainly on the Supreme Court, would have a very hard time justifying what is being done in Florida and in other states to restrict curriculum. It's just, sadly, those cases are moving at a glacial pace, as lawsuits often do. There are several out there that are suing not only in Florida, but elsewhere, but they just take forever to get resolved. And that's why it feels like, holy shit, things are falling apart. They're getting their way. Well, not really. A lot of these laws have been sort of put on hold by the courts. But in the meantime, teachers are pulling things from their shelves. Yeah. The College Board is backtracking significantly on what that AP course is going to look like. They won't admit that. They say they're not, but I don't believe them, because the timing of it suggests that they were aware of these critiques well before they started making those changes. And all the changes they made just so happened to line up perfectly with the things that were being critiqued. So I think we ought to concern ourselves with that. But the thread that you mentioned that I had on Twitter, what I wanted to point out that I think people miss when they criticize this class, and I've got my own beef with the folks at the College Board. I don't think the SAT is a very legitimate test, for instance. I got all kinds of issues with the College Board as an organization. The guy who's the head of it, David Coleman, I have an interesting, funny story about David. He's a nice guy, and I think a really well-intended guy. I have a very funny story about him going back to high school, because I knew him back in high school. But he was a debater at Stuyvesant, New York City, and I knew him through the circuit. But so I'll tell you that story if you want to hear it. It's funny. Yeah. But before we get to that, the thing about AP classes that I think people don't understand is, like you said, they are pre-college. They are essentially meant to mirror a college course. They are an accelerated class. It's much more advanced, and it's not simply a survey class of the subject that happens to be done at a faster pace. It's not that. It's actually meant to mirror a college course. So, for instance, if you take AP microeconomics or macroeconomics, it's going to look like what you would take your first year of college. If you take AP Chem, it's going to be the same thing. AP American Studies, same thing. AP African American Studies is a phrase that represents a discipline. African American Studies is a discipline, whether people like that or not. I know there are people out there who think it shouldn't be. It doesn't matter. It is one. And they're trying to create a course similar to what that looks like in college. Well, when you take an academic discipline, it has a pedagogical approach. It has experts. It has a curriculum. It has what it has at the college level. And yes, does African American Studies as a discipline lean, I guess, politically to the left? Sure, the same way econ leans politically to the right. They focus on classical liberal and free market ideology. They don't teach labor theory from a Marxist perspective in most econ departments. And I wouldn't expect that your AP econ courses do either. Certain disciplines lean left or they lean right based on the kind of people that go into them a lot of times. And the kind of people that go into African American Studies don't tend to be right wingers. Like, that's not their career choice. You ask a person who's a MAGA person, they're not like, well, I could be a banker, or, I could be a billionaire making some kind of tech gadgetry, or I could go teach at a college Black studies. Like, that's not what they don't go into sociology. They don't go into women's studies. If they want those disciplines to be more balanced, all they got to do is get a different degree. Get a different degree. The market has spoken. The market has said, these are the people that want to take. If you don't like it, don't take it.
Right.
AP classes are voluntary, fool. You don't have to take them. Nobody can sit you down and make you read Kim Crenshaw. Nobody can sit you down and whip you until you read Derek Bell and memorize the book And We Are Not Saved. Like, nobody is going to force you to bow down to Assata Shakur in a backyard shrine. Like, you don't have to even learn about that if you don't want to. It's voluntary. But when you are outside the discipline, critiquing the discipline and trying to change what can be taught in the discipline, you're no longer talking about an AP course. You're basically saying, well, it's fine if it's a survey class of, great Black people in history. That's not what it is. It's a discipline that has its own internal curriculum, its own experts, its own pedagogical approach. And for you to critique it from outside would be like saying, well, that AP geology exam needs to have a flat earther, or needs to have a young earth creationist,
right,
or that AP history exam needs to have a Holocaust denier for balance. No, fool, that's not part of the discipline. The discipline and the experts in the field have rejected that bullshit. So the College Board has the right to reject it too. That's what I think people miss, is they don't have to add right wingers to the curriculum. They don't have. And the reason is, yes, there have always been Black people who were conservative.
Yeah.
Even using the definition that we use now. But conservatism within the Black community has never been a cohesive movement. It has never been an organic movement where you had a group of Black people coming out and essentially saying, let's accommodate to white supremacy. Right. Even Booker T. Washington, who'd be maybe the best example historically. And he's in the AP class, by the way. They don't ignore him. Booker T. Washington, who's maybe the best example of a Black conservative who actually had a large constituency. A lot of it was white, but he also had some Black constituencies as well. He certainly did. But that is an example of someone whose theory at that time, however much he's been maligned, and I disagree with him in his debates with W.E.B. Du Bois, he did actually believe that industrial labor was the best path to freedom and opportunity for Black people. Booker T. Washington was still arguing from a perspective that believed, however naively I might think, that rather than political agitation, rather than fighting for equal rights, which is what Du Bois was arguing for, that it would be better for Black folks to, as he put it, cast their buckets down where they are and just work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever. So that movement did exist at the time, and it's certainly fine to talk about it. But since that time, you cannot say that there's been any cohesive movement of Black conservatism that would need to be included in an African-American studies program. You don't need to study Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams and all of these right-wing economists that all the white folks love, precisely because they have no constituencies in the Black community. I'm not saying that there are no Black people who agree with them, but do they have a cohesive constituency that would justify them being taught side by side with critical race theory, which does have a cohesive constituency, or with progressive theorists more broadly, which certainly do have a constituency? No, of course not. African-American studies scholars, those in the field, have the right to say this is what our discipline is. And it is not Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell and, other right-wing commentators. And so they shouldn't be able to intimidate as they have the College Board. But unfortunately, it seems that they have.
Yes. And we'll see what happens. But as you said, the devil's in the details, and there's no reason to think that they are going to walk any of that back, I guess. So,
right.
Well,
shall I tell you my David Coleman story?
Oh, yes. Go ahead. Yes.
So, like I said, I think he's a good guy. I have not seen David since we were in high school, and I wasn't close with him. He was closer with a couple of the other debaters on the team. But in 1986, we were in Tulsa, Oklahoma for the national championship, the National Forensics League, which is what it was called then. It's now the National Debate and Speech Association, or Speech and Debate Association. But the National Forensics League at the time had its national tournament in Tulsa, and we were there. The top debate team, two guys that were the top team were there debating. I was there for like student Congress. And we had gone one morning over to the Waffle House across from the hotel in Tulsa. This is back when Oral Roberts University was still had the hospital downtown with the big praying hands. I don't know if you're familiar with the big wooden praying, or maybe they're steel. I don't know. They're wooden hands that praying to Jesus. They used to be outside the hospital, which I always found weird. Like, I don't need the hands at the hospital. I need medicine. Do you have medicine at the hospital is what I want to know. But they since moved the hands. I think they lost the hospital. It was bought out by a corporation. They've moved the hands over to Oral Roberts University, where you can still see them today. But in any event, we walk over to the Waffle House, and David Coleman's there. He's on the top team at Stuyvesant High School in New York City. And David, because he's from New York, had never been to a Waffle House, needless to say. And we're sitting there, and the waitress comes around, and David Coleman says, and this is not really his voice. It's really closer to Woody Allen's voice, but I think it's just funny because it fits the situation. He looks at the waitress and he says, "I would like a grit, please." A grit. Singular. I would like a grit, please. And we just all sort of laugh.
I don't know. I've never ordered grits, but I know they don't come singularly. And I certainly know that's not
singular. And the waitress said, "Darling, do you want grits?" And I don't think he followed up with this, but in my mind, I want him to have said, "I just want to start with one. I don't know if I'm going to like them enough. I don't know if I'm going to like them enough for a whole plate of them. I just would like to start with one grit, and I'll let you know." I don't know if he said it, and I don't know why I do Woody Allen's voice with David. But as a fellow Jew,
it works. I like it. That's great.
I'm allowed that as a fellow member of the tribe. But it was hilarious, and so I always thought he was a really fantastic debater and a good guy. And I think he's still a good guy. But I just think in this particular instance, he and his colleagues, when it came to developing this test, have allowed too many people to be in their ears. Now, to their credit, they came out and said after the controversy that they were angry at DeSantis. They shouldn't have allowed them to push as much as they did, or to make it seem like they had intimidated them. So I don't know. It's hard to know what's true and what's not. But of course, in response, what did DeSantis do? Now he just wants to get rid of AP in the state altogether as a way to punish the College Board, and maybe get rid of the SAT, which I would be totally down for, except that DeSantis's substitute is some kind of Jesus test. It's some kind of classical history and religion test to the greatest ideas in Western Christian cultural thought, which is going to go over very well with the Jewish kids in Palm Beach. I'm sure the ones in Miami are going to love taking a test on the Christian culture that they're a part of. I mean, again, who knows? In this debate between DeSantis and David Coleman, I'm certainly far more on team David Coleman in the College Board than I am DeSantis. But they both have a lot of blame here, in the sense that the College Board doesn't have the courage to just say, you know what, we're going to put out the best curriculum we can put out, and we're not going to listen to any of your stupid criticisms. And if you decide to cancel our test in your state, so be it. We'll be willing to take the financial hit. That's what I want to hear them say. That's what I want to hear David Coleman and others come out and say, is screw you. Right. But are they going to say that? I sort of doubt it. I wish they would.
I don't understand how any of that works or where the pressure comes from, but you would hope that there would be support from other states and from other stakeholders that you would think wouldn't be a hard choice for them to make on advanced placement African American history. It's right. I mean, how are these things supposed to be taught? How are these narratives supposed to go? Feminist history is supposed to be taught by a bunch of Catholic priests. Like, I don't. Right. It's you already explained it so well. I mean,
what they are basically saying is, we don't want the Black experience to be taught from an unapologetically Black perspective, right? They want the Black experience to be taught objectively. Well, it wasn't lived objectively. It wasn't experienced objectively, right? Black people have experienced the history the way they've experienced it. And what white people think about that experience is irrelevant to the Black experience. It doesn't have to be part of the conversation. Now, if we're talking about American history, then anyone who is an American, and that's a big bunch of people, all our perspectives should be part of it, including the Black perspective, including the Asian American perspective, the Latinx perspective, and all of those perspectives. But if it's the Black perspective, you're going to teach the dominant strains of thought, within the black community. You're not going to just pick every outlier. That would mean that we would have to give equal time to the black ministers who disagreed with the civil rights movement and Dr. King and thought that protest was bad. No, they don't deserve to be taught in the class as if that was a serious constituency within black America. They just don't.
Right.
Is black conservatism worth talking about at all? Well, sure. And in fact, some of the radical thinkers who are taught in the class have engaged directly with those strains of thought. Part of what critical race theory was trying to do, and I've said this on your show before, was trying to explain the same thing that conservatives were trying to explain and that liberals, classical or not classical liberals, but straight up old school progressive liberals were trying to explain. And what was that? Why is it that 30 years approximately after the passage of civil rights laws, there was still so much profound inequality? That was the foundational question of critical race theory. They were basically saying, listen, we're legal scholars and we don't really understand what's going on, but we want to because we were always told once we pass these laws that things would change. And they didn't really change. So we want to know why. And liberals would say, well, it just takes time. You know, we're 95% of the way there. We just got to keep marching. That's what Obama said. Conservatives would say, well, it's because black people are broken and their cultures are flawed and they have too many babies out of wedlock and they're screwed up. That's what the right would say to that. And critical race theory was saying, we don't buy either of those perspectives. We don't buy the black people are broken perspective, and we don't buy the it's just a matter of time perspective. We're arguing that actually what we underestimated was how foundational racism was to the fabric of everyday American life. And we need to not underestimate that. We need to understand it as foundational and shape-shifting and systematized so that we can actually ascertain strategies for undoing it, because this piecemeal reform stuff or the blaming black people stuff isn't going to work. So indeed, they do engage black conservatives but in a way that says, y'all have lost your minds and you don't know what you're talking about. And here's a theory that better explains reality.
Right. Before I let you go, any thoughts on the comments? I know it's such low hanging fruit, but I'm sure you had something smart to say about Marjorie Taylor Greene's comments about national divorce, red states, blue states. I mean, that really was a moment last week with that tweet, and she's doubled down on it. Marjorie
has a lot of divorce on her mind lately. Dear Marjorie. We understand why.
That's not fair. Oh God, that's beneath her. I mean, us. What?
But it's not. Well, right. I don't know what's beneath her, but I know it's not beneath us.
Nothing. She ranted and raved yesterday. People came and criticized her in public.
But she didn't name the place. Right. I think it's all bullshit. I don't think it happened. Where's the video of that? She screamed like a howler monkey at the State of the Union.
Yes.
I would call her a howler monkey, but it's like an insult to howler monkeys. Yes. And howler monkeys never tried to overthrow the government. So I probably shouldn't make the comparison. But look, when you say you want a national divorce, aside from the fact that I'm pretty sure that that's seditious and treasonous talk, and it's the kind of thing that no elected official is supposed to be able to advocate according to the law after the Civil War. I mean, you actually look at what the law says. Look at what the 14th Amendment says. Look at you're not supposed to be able to advocate for the separation of the country again. That's sort of like we had this conversation and y'all lost. Y'all lost. The Confederates lost. If you don't like it, she can go up to Stone Mountain, not too far from where she's from, and she can pay homage and light a candle at the engraving of Stonewall Jackson or whatever the hell's up there. But it's an absurdity. It's treasonous and seditious talk. And more importantly, what it ignores is that if it weren't, you could take all these red states that she says need to divorce because, these Hollywood liberals don't have our values. Those Hollywood liberals brought the film industry into Atlanta and have bailed your backward ass state.
That's right. That's a great point. That's a great point. Yes, there's a huge film industry now, billions of dollars in Atlanta.
Absolutely huge. And if it weren't for the blue cities and metropolitan areas in those red states, including mine here in Tennessee, if it weren't for Nashville and Memphis, what do you think is going to happen to Tennessee? There is nobody coming to look at a grain silo in Hohenwald. There is nobody that's coming to the Strawberry Festival in Frog Leap, whatever the hell it is.
Hey, how dare you attack the Strawberry Festival in Frog Leap?
I mean, there's actually a great strawberry festival in Portland, Tennessee, which is up near the Kentucky border, but it's not going to keep your state alive. Like that, you are not going to be able to have a state functioning if you don't have these blue voting cities, because that's where the people with the most education and the most money are, and that's where they spend their money, and that's where the tourists come, and that's where the businesses locate. So if you actually want a divorce, I'm like, I'm at the point where I don't even want to argue with you. I just want to argue about the terms. And I want to suggest to you that the terms of the divorce need to be local. I want Nashville and Memphis to secede from the rest of y'all's ass. I want Atlanta and I want Savannah and whatever to secede from the rest of Georgia and leave her and her Forsyth County, where she's from, only famous for one thing, kicking out black people back in the first decade of the 20th century. Well, I think we should just kick all of her people to the curb and let Atlanta go its own way. And we'll see how quick, we'll see how quickly they start coming back. Because even when they try to secede, there's a movement in Atlanta, in Buckhead, which is the wealthier, whiter part of Atlanta. They've been trying to secede for years because they don't want to be associated with black Atlanta, right? So they've been trying to have Buckhead's going to secede so we don't have to deal with, we have a better tax base. And it's like, really? You want to do that? Because the airport is in the other part. And the only water source that y'all get your water from is the river, and it's in the other part. So if you want to pay for the water, and if you want to pay for access to the airport and not get the tax revenues from the airport, y'all feel free. And as soon as that came up, they were like, oh, shit, maybe we don't want to secede. See, so all these red state people need to remember that if it weren't for those of us in blue areas, thank you very much, you're welcome, y'all would be sitting there eating your own soybeans, right? And I know their comeback is, well, but we feed y'all. If it weren't for us, you'd be starving to death. Well, if you're, most of the time you're making grain to feed cows, not people, right? And if it weren't for the people who do buy your produce, then you wouldn't be able to make a living. Well, guess where the people live who buy your produce? They live in the city. Do you just sell when you grow shit, do you just sell it to your neighbors? Like you got a whole field full of corn and like the 27 people in your zip code eat all the corn? No, fool. You bring that to where I live and I eat the corn. You're welcome. If I didn't live here, I'd be living somewhere else and you wouldn't be able to sell your shit to me. So the country folk literally depend on the city folk for survival. And it has almost always been that way. You are welcome, Marjorie Taylor Greene. You are absolutely welcome. I will be glad to negotiate the terms of this divorce, but I don't think people like MGT are going to like it very much.
Oh, my God. So good. One more thing. You mentioned you invoked your state of Tennessee, and I know you're familiar with the news coming out of your state. The governor there, Bill Lee is his name. He is going to sign an anti-drag show bill, even though apparently there's a photo of him from high school dressed in drag. But this is, wow. Wow. I mean, what is it? How do you outlaw drag show? What does that even look like, that legislation? What do you want to say about this?
I mean, it looks like a state legislature that doesn't think Tennesseans have actual problems with inadequate health care. We've got a child welfare system where we've got hundreds of kids that have been sleeping on the floors of child protection offices. They can't find places for them. They're being shuttled back and forth. Nobody's being taken care of. We've got schools that don't have enough textbooks, even before they started banning some of them. We've got all kinds of problems in this state. And this is not among them, but this is what they do. This is a legislature that is more worried about a drag queen at storytime hour reading a children's book to a kid or some drag brunch at a brunch spot than they are dealing with real problems that face Tennesseans every day. It's just it's the same thing that they do it all the time with all kinds of issues. This is the same group of people that, years ago, they were like, well, we got a lot of things we could be taking care of, jobs and schools and crime and all that. But no, let's just make the Bible the state book, y'all, because it's not like we got other shit to do. Or let's just make this rifle the state gun, because it's not like we got business.
Did they do that?
Yes, they did that. And now, now their thing, obviously, with drag is not about people. It's not about men dressing like women. It's about gay people. It's about gay folks and trans folk, because Bill Lee dressed in drag. But, we all know he's straight, or at least, we all know whatever, I guess. Right. I guess he is. I don't know. But they didn't mind it. It's no big deal. Oh, if Flip Wilson did it, it was funny. Right. But if someone that's another reference, it won't land for anybody that's under the age of 50 in your audience. But, it's fine if a guy does it, as long as we know at the end of the day that he goes home to a woman, right, and gives it to her the right way. but God forbid it's at a story time where I guess they believe that these drag queens are like whispering to children about like lube and anal toys or something. I don't know what they think these things are about. It's a damn children's book. It just so happens
they think that their kids are going to dress up as. That's what they think. That's what they're wearing.
I mean, I guess they think that's like the worst thing that could happen. But like if your kid decides to go play like full contact football and get CTE by the time they're 15, that's all right. Because at least that's what real men do. Yeah. We get brain damage on the football field. We wouldn't want, however, for that person to be, well, first of all, we don't want them to read. We don't really want them to read at all, let alone be read to by a drag queen. That's obvious. But, you know, there's so much that the state is trying to do right now. Here in Tennessee, they're trying to do that, of course. They are also, of course, among the many states that is attempting to restrict and has restricted women's reproductive freedom. They are now they've banned any kind of gender confirmation treatment at all, not just actual surgery, but any kind of treatment that a doctor might give, even to someone who is fully aware of what they're doing. Their parents are fully aware. They give permission. This is not being done on 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. The surgeries, actual genital surgery, had not been done at all by Vanderbilt Hospital, although Matt Walsh, in his infinite wisdom, lied about that and had all kinds of hateful people calling into Vanderbilt Hospital, accusing them of mutilating children, which was not happening. But this is what they think is important. This is the kind of stuff that they do to try to make life miserable for the people that they hate. This is the kind of stuff that they do. These are people who it took years for them to take down a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest that was in the Capitol. And yes, I know all the right wingers say, well, Democrats put it there. Right. And then Democrats were like, let's get rid of that racist shit. And it was Republicans who were like, well, now hold on a minute. It's heritage. Wait a minute. Like you could have just banned it and said it was a horrible Democrat and you wouldn't even do that.
Yeah.
Like, no, we got to leave it there because that's heritage. And, you know, so they can't get rid of a racist bust in the Capitol. They can't take care of children that are being left falling through the cracks of child protection services. They can't make sure that everyone's got adequate health care. They can't make sure that our schools are well funded. They can't do any of that. And we're still ranked very near the bottom in every indicator of everything important. But they're going to make damn sure that you can't dress up in drag in a public place where children might be present. And they're prepared to actually incarcerate people who break that rule. So this is how incredibly backwards the right is. It's culture war all the time. It's authoritarianism all the time. It's Christian nationalism all the time. And it's time for the rest of us to insist that these things not only offend our sensibilities and our morals, but they offend the Constitution of the United States. In some cases, they offend our religion. These bans on abortion and on reproductive health care violate Jewish interpretation of the issue of when life begins. They impose a fundamentalist Christian interpretation, which ought to be another violation of the Constitution because it imposes one religious belief on the rest of the country. It's time to start playing with these people the same way they play with us, with no mercy, with no attempt to compromise. It's either they win or we win. And I'm just tired of the Democratic Party acting like there's some reasonable people in this coalition. There's not. It's time for them to lose and to lose painfully. Well,
it certainly is good to be in your church, I'll call it. Your pulpit. Tim Wise, always a pleasure, man. Thank you. Oh, I get it. What about the Washington Post editorial board? They had no people of color on the editorial board, 15 people. That was, some people say if you read their coverage, you wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, I don't know enough about the Washington Post coverage on issues regarding race or. Yeah.
So, I mean, some of their coverage on race is actually not all that bad. So it was a bit surprising only in the sense that in this particular day and age, and especially when you have the New York Times having put all the money and effort that they did into the 1619 project as just one example. And they still have their issues as any black or brown person at the Times will tell you. But when you've got your main sort of national competitor having made a really deliberate effort, right, to do some serious stuff around race and to have a much more diverse board of people, so far as I can recall from at least a couple of years ago on the editorial board there, it is a bit shocking that you would have no one. And it's not like you can't find any people to be on that board in Washington.
Sure.
Or in the greater Washington area, like
sure.
there are black folks there. It was called Chocolate City for a reason. You just got to walk out. There's black folks there.
Yeah.
And so I'm
More
sure they
than
can find
qualified
at least
ones.
There've got to be at least a few that we can shoehorn in there.
That's crazy to me. That was a surprising thing. That's not going to be.
It is disturbing, but it's not altogether shocking. And I think that's that's such a fundamental, and that actually speaks to one more thing that I'll say before we go that I put out on Twitter, a thread that did pretty well about institutional racism, because one of the things that someone said in response to what I had said about the Scott Adams stuff was, try to change the subject and say, well, all you leftists, you try to talk about institutional racism, but there is no such thing because there are no laws anymore that mandate oppression like there used to be. Right. And so since there's no law mandating racism, there can't be institutional racism. Well, it's a ridiculous argument, right? First of all, institutional is not a synonym for legal. It's just not. And the idea that an institutional action has to be a legal action, that does not comport with any dictionary definition of the word institutional. It doesn't comport with any common sense use of the word. Institutions have policies, practices, and procedures. Some of them are formal. Some of them are informal. Any institution you can think of, labor market, criminal justice system, the school system, the housing market, the healthcare delivery system, any institution that you can think of has policies. Some of them are formal. Some of them are mandated by law. Some of them are just customs and practices, right? So in the job market, as an example, going back to the Washington Post, what is the way that jobs are obtained disproportionately in this country, according to years and years of research? It isn't because of some objective open competition where we all throw our resumes in a pile and they go, well, you're more qualified than you are. That's not how it works. Mostly it's connections and contacts, who you know more than what you know. And so if the people who are in the know in certain job networks are going to be overwhelmingly white, and the research says they will be, overwhelmingly male, and the research says they will be, overwhelmingly upper middle class or affluent, and the research says they will be, and certainly for editorial gigs at the Washington Post, they will be, then we can't be surprised when the outcome of that process, of that procedure is a racial imbalance, a gender imbalance, a class imbalance. We would expect that to happen. That is a form of institutional racism. Is it deliberate? No, not necessarily. There could be potentially no overt racist anywhere at the Post. And I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying it could be. You could have no racist in the HR departments of any company. You could have no racist at the Washington Post. But if they are thinking to themselves, who do we need on this editorial board? Oh, so-and-so. Yeah, they do. I'll get them. And the people that you're pointing to, if I know Jim over in that department and you know Ted over there, Jim and Ted get us these gigs. We're now on the editorial board, or we're working in the corporate setting, or whatever it is. It may not be because we're the most qualified, but we knew the right people. That has a racially disparate impact. That's what institutional racism means. And it's what it has always meant.
I'm glad you explained all that, but I feel like there's something more fundamental, which is the Voting Rights Act, that we could point to further the argument. The Voting Rights Act, Section 2 and Section 5, basically been repealed, and immediately, like an hour after, was it Texas, whoever changed their voting laws to make it harder for black folks to vote. Voter ID is, even before that. I mean, these you could I always just start at voting, Tim.
Right. Well, in North Carolina was a great example. North Carolina, when they wanted to pass their voter ID law, they first asked the state for information before they decided, like, what ID should we ask for? Which ones will count? Which ones will not count? They asked the state for data that would show them which IDs were black people less likely to have. And then when they found that out, they made sure that that was the ID that you had to have, so much so that the court said, when it struck down that law originally, and I'm not sure where it stands now, I think part of it might have been put in place after all, but that particular, the way it had been written originally, the court said that this targeted black voters with almost surgical precision.
Yes, that's right.
So it was quite deliberate, but technically, if you're one of those people that says, well, there can't be institutional racism unless there's a formal law mandating racism, then you would say that that's not institutional racism. If I rig the system with a procedure that now the law allows, laws don't only mandate things, they also allow certain things, right? If the law allows me to get away with doing racial profiling because it isn't illegal, right, for me to profile in a way that is racial profiling, like the war on drugs has been, then I can get away with it. There's no law mandating that cops target black people, right? But what the law says is cops have, and we always have known this, have the right to enforce the law selectively. Like if you go out of your driveway and you forget to signal a lane change and I do the same, they don't have to stop us both. And if they stop me and not you, I can't say, hey, you didn't stop Pete. Like that's not a defense, right? They have the right to selectively enforce. But when they selectively enforce because the law allows them to get away with that, that's still capable of being called institutional racism. The same thing with voter ID or other, laws that are rules that are put in place to say what the voting procedure is going to be, or how many machines are going to be in this precinct versus that precinct, or how many days are we going to allow early voting? We know that early voting is disproportionately engaged in by people of color, by working class folks, by students. So when you say we're going to cut the days of early voting, even though, you don't say overtly you're doing that to hurt black people, it doesn't say less black people voting. That's the law. But you know that the consequence of your actions is going to be, at least at the margins, fewer black people voting. That's institutional racism. It's also individual racism on the part of the people that did that, but it takes place within an institutional setting that recreates and replicates inequality. And that's why we distinguish it from just personal or interpersonal racism.
Well done. Thank you so much, man, for your time, for your explanations, for your scholarship. So appreciated. And I hope to talk to you again soon, as always.
All right, man. Thank you.
All right, there he goes, everybody. Tim Jacob Wise, timjwise.medium.com. Support him on Patreon like I do. Follow him on Twitter at timjacobwise. Read his threads there. Read all of his stuff. Always great. Love talking to him. He's such a brilliant philosopher and scholar. And I just think he's an invaluable American treasure. I really do. And if you don't agree with something he said or how he said it, let me know. I'll put you on with him. Or you can, if you don't want to go up against him because he's terrifying, leave a voicemail or something. Send me a message. Shouldn't be too hard to get, and I'll play it for him. How about that? All right, I hope to see you at tonight's Hangout. If you're a listener subscriber, then you can join us. I'm going to have some special guests, hopefully. And I'm going to definitely make a big announcement at 8:15. You'll hear it first if you're a subscriber that joins the Hangout tonight. So I hope to see you there. Get the link by subscribing. You'll get an email. The link will be in there, and I'll see you at 8 East tonight. That's all for today. And I hope that you're doing okay. I like this quote that Matty C. told me. A friend of his told him, so I'll end on this. Competition is the thief of joy. How about it? Yeah, stop comparing yourself to other people. You're stealing your own joy. Love you guys. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
The devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. While you lying awake wondering where the money all went, it'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up